Hi, everybody. I'm going to be talking with my mask on, so if you can't hear me, wave, and I'm a theater person, so I can project. Thank you so much to Eve and Miriam and Alan, and especially Amanda, for all of your help with my very arduous travel details. I had to get my university travel policy changed to come here, and I'm very happy to be here and back in international conversation. And thank you for everybody. This is such an inspiring and wonderful group of papers, and I'm very grateful. So on April 15th, 1967, Judith Malina wrote in her diary, "I want to write everything down to show how beautiful it is." Judith Malina, who was born in 1926 and died in 2015, instructed that the words actor, director, pacifist, anarchist, diarist, poet, and muse should be carved onto her gravestone in the Cedar Park Cemetery in Paramus, New Jersey, in the United States. Malina was all of those things: an innovative artist, a visionary anarchist, and a lifelong chronicler of observations and events. She's best known as an actor and director who, with her husband, Julian Beck, founded the Living Theater in New York in 1947. Malina ran the theater company until her death in 2015. The Living Theater is, as of this writing, the oldest experimental theater group still existing in the United States. The company boasts more than half a century of resisting commercial theater, innovating what theater could and might be, and exploring ways outside the mainstream for living and working in community. In the theater and her life, and for her there was no difference between the two, German, American, Jewish Judith Malina was passionate, accomplished, and determined. Her whole being in life and art was predicated on resistance. In the mid-1940s, her teacher, Erwin Piscator, told her most female students marry and give up the theater anyway, a moment she discusses in an August 1968 diary entry. And still she plowed forward with her ambitions to be a director. In her marriage, Malina resisted normative confines of sex and love and bucked traditional motherhood expectations. When she translated and directed Bertolt Brecht's adaptation of Antigone in the mid-60s, she played the title role of the defiant young woman. In fact, as Cindy Rosenthal highlights, Malina so strongly identified with the role that she performed it until she was in her late 50s, and offstage, she embraced Antigone as a way of being in the world. I've spent the past 6 years locating, editing, transcribing, and preparing for publication an edited collection of Malina's diaries from 1958 through 1971, part of my larger project to edit her lifetime unpublished diaries. I believe this is going to be a 3-volume collection, and I'm doing this on my own with no team. I'm very envious of those of you with teams. These diaries record her daily life, her work as a director and actor, her commitment to pushing and exploding the form of theater, her relationships, her children, her relentless drive to change the world. On June 17th, 1970, she wrote, "We drive around Amsterdam in Jack Moore's well-supplied truck and talk about changing the world." These diaries highlight her achievements as a stage director in an era when this was an exceedingly rare path for a woman. They reveal her deep Jewish spirituality. The diaries also chronicle her many faults, contradictions, and missteps. Perhaps most crucially, they provide the most extensive record that exists of the work of her company, the Living Theater, and all of the conversations and decisions and artistic processes that went into their work, information that usually gets lost in theater history, where we tend to focus most on final productions in lieu of processes. The indelible descriptor diarist on her headstone signals that diary keeping was core to Malina's identity and occupied a tremendous amount of her energy and time. She often wrote every day with entries that might consist of a single word or, more likely, cover 20 or more pages, usually in mostly clear cursive. The diaries contain locks of hair, receipts, photographs, sugar packets, and other objects, and Malina often included drawings alongside her writings. She wrote in multiple languages using words, phrases, and sometimes whole passages in French, German, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, Portuguese, and Yiddish. She wrote in anticipation of an audience, and even once in November 1967 addresses a potential reader as "you." Jimmy clucks through his mirrored neck. Cal takes a dozen tokes. Chiwe is eating a hairbrush. Are you bored by domestic details? She devoured diaries by other writers, including those of André Gide, Henry David Thoreau, William McCready, and Leo Tolstoy. She was particularly enamored with Anais Nin. On May 25th, 1950, Molina wrote of Nin, "Her diaries, though still unpublished, are already famous, lengthy, and probably terribly literary. I sometimes wish mine were lyrical and artful, but I have already embarked on something different." Now, we should also note that she also wrote list books, including lists of names and foods. She had rehearsal notebooks, letters, sketchbooks, collage books, and many other things. She spent much time wondering about the diary genre. At the home of Elizabeth Bishop in Brazil on June 8th, 1971, she writes, "On her bookshelves, I find the diaries of Virginia Woolf and Dorothy Wordsworth and Franz Kafka, and I leaf through them and note the sameness of certain traits of journals. The weather reports, the travel descriptions, the dialogues with contemporaries remembered and recorded or misrecorded, the constant complaints about time, the poetic flashes amidst the daily dreck." Of her own diary keeping practice, Molina wrote on Easter Sunday in 1956, "I set my course by the landmarks of my history, for I love monument, memorial, anniversary, and poem, cherish inscription, symbol, and ritual drama." Molina's son once told me that she wanted every word of her diaries published. To this end, Molina herself edited 2 volumes of her diaries. First, The Enormous Despair, published by Random House in 1972, which spans August 1968 to April 1969, and then the Diaries of Judith Malina, 1947 to 57, published in 1984 by Grove Press. Both are significant contributions to theater history and performance studies for their glimpses into Molina's inner life as director, actor, and activist. They provide crucial details about the history of her company. They also resonate beyond the theater. Her descriptive writing style and her many detailed observations of people and places cement the diary's broad appeal. While she had a voracious desire to write and publish her diaries, Molina went through painstaking years-long processes of editing and revising these in preparation for their publication. It took her more than 10 years to prepare her 47 to 57 diaries for publication. And still throughout her life, she remained compelled to write everything down to show how beautiful it is. The earliest entry I discovered was in a little square 5-year diary with a red cover that I found as I sifted through the boxes of her archives at Yale's Beinecke. She kept diaries all the way to the end of her life when her cursive melted into pained scribbles, and she sometimes asked friends to write for her so she could keep recording. The sheer mass of notebooks and diary entries and other papers overwhelms, as does the thought of finding that much time to write in what, as her diaries make clear, is a very busy life of travel and rehearsal and writing and motherhood and endless administrative work and relationships. These are the 2008 to 2015 diaries that I'll tell you about in a minute that her son showed me in her storage locker after she died in Lower Manhattan, and then gave me to fly to Portland, Oregon, where I live, and then scan them and then fly back with them, which was a total trip. I had met him once. He was like, "Take these." And I was like, "Okay." And then afterwards, I put them in touch with the Beinecke, so they now live there instead of a wet storage locker. Despite the regularity of her diary writing practice, there are times that Molina didn't write. On October 30th, 1959, she notes, "I have no time to write in my journal or to think of death." She sometimes grappled with the idea of diary writing, observing on January 16th, 1961, "When I write, I lie." Later that year, on May 29th, she asked, "Shall I keep a publishable journal? Why should anyone care?" On January 28th, after a period of no entries, she adds, "Why I do not write, the disparity between inner and outer experience." There are also extended periods of time when Molina pivots in her diary keeping style. At times, she writes in precise and sometimes exhaustive detail, recording daily events. At other times, she composes poetic forms and captures feelings as opposed to facts. Her style sometimes shifts when she starts a new diary book, perhaps because each fresh notebook offers an implicit invitation to experiment with another style. She was aware of this duality in her writing. On May 7th, 1951, she notes a tendency to waver in her recording style. I waver between a record of events and a diary of feelings. In the first years, I had reservations. Now I am shameless. This tension between logging feelings and events comes up again a decade later in a reflection about soul versus work from May 1961. Quote, yesterday I made a note, afraid to begin a journal, not sure of my motive, wanting to keep two journals, a journal of the heart and spirit, and a journal of the mind and the world, a journal of work and a journal of the soul. I have lost the ground I stood on. I am at sea, and he divided the waters. Do I really mean that I divide my world in half? I should go up on deck and look at the sea, but I love the soft gloom of the cabin. I made a note on the sea, but I hesitated to write it down because I felt obliged to keep a journal of theatrical events. This is Judith with one of her notebooks. We don't have a lot of pictures of her with them, but there's a couple, and I really like this one. In her essay on keeping a notebook, Joan Didion highlights how in journal writing, the writer often engages in self-doubt and self-deception, echoing the feelings Molina grapples with when she analyzes her own impulses as a diarist, and when she wrestles with writing, not writing, and how to write. Didion asks, why did I write it down? In order to remember, of course, but exactly what was it I wanted to remember? How much of it actually happened? Did any of it? Why do I keep a notebook at all? It is easy to deceive oneself on all these scores. The impulse to write things down is a peculiarly compulsive one, inexplicable to those who do not share it, useful only accidentally, only secondarily, in the way that any compulsion tries to justify itself. I suppose that it begins or does not begin in the cradle. Keepers of private notebooks are a different breed altogether, lonely and resistant rearrangers of things, anxious malcontents. In her diaries, most notably while she was in Brazil, but other places as well, Molina at times deceives herself, especially about her Americanness and her whiteness. She wrestles with who she is versus who she wants to be. Her self-deception is clear throughout the Brazil diaries, where in her work, she wants to do good, but is unable to see her own capacity for hostility, colonialism, and oppression. Her diaries depict Molina's greatest flaws and also her soaring attributes. They invite readers to see both sides, to really see her in glaring detail. That is the risk of the diary as a form. It opens up the diarist to scrutiny and judgment. Molina's diaries serve as both places for reflection and for recording, sometimes both in one entry and sometimes she alternates. This is part of the split she discusses between a record of events and diary of feelings. And yet, even in later years with her own Facebook account, Molina kept a written diary until the month before her death in 2015. Her lifetime spanning diaries form a formidable and lasting archive where social media won't, as Tracy Drake of the Blackavists warns about our contemporary impulse to think of social media as a site to store our thoughts, photos, and records. The forms change, Drake reminds, and while Instagram may be here today, the technology soon will be obsolete and all our records will be lost. I came to this project in 2015, invited on board after it was already in motion with Garrick Beck and Isha Appel, Molina's children, and the living theater archivist Tom Walker. I met with Beck and Walker at the East Village Tavern on Avenue C and 10th Street in New York on August 4th, 2015. It turned out Molina's son attended Reed College, where I'm a professor. We headed to Molina's nearby storage locker, where Beck and Walker showed me boxes of family photographs and props from various living theater productions. Eventually, they pulled out a red rolling suitcase that contained Molina's 2008 to 2015 diaries, dozens of notebooks with Molina's favorite chinoiserie satin floral covers. Since then, my goal with this project has been to honor Molina and her fiery spirit of resistance. I want to help bring deeper context to her work and illuminate aspects of her life and history that will resonate for students, scholars, artists, activists, and a general readership. While editing her writing from May 1970, I was struck by her vivid description of running through Latin Quarter streets amid tear gas and police violence. I worked on this section during the summer 2020 Portland protests, in which I ran through tear gas-filled streets, fleeing police officers and National Guard soldiers. Molina's writing can make the reader feel alongside her in the moment she was writing, a feature that foregrounds contemporary parallels. The next volume of this book will begin with Molina, Beck, and some members of the Living Theatre in jail in Brazil in 1971. While editing this book, my mother died fast and unexpectedly in August 2019. When cleaning out her house, I saw that, like Molina, my mom saved everything, from locks of hair to dried flowers to postcards, receipts, and tickets. As a high school student, she had the same square 5-year diary with a gold lock that Molina had in her youth. While going through my mom's life, I thought about Molina and the importance of archives, especially for women, and the importance of preserving and telling their stories from their viewpoints and all their contradictions. Molina's trove of firsthand observations is particularly important given theater's ongoing gender gap, which, while still prominent, was even more severe at the time she wrote the diaries included in my forthcoming book. In interviews and at appearances, critics and members of the press often passed over Molina in favor of her husband. Public and private erasures happened to her frequently. Publishing her diaries helps redress those moments by spotlighting her as a groundbreaker of both theatrical form and artistic activism. Her tremendous accomplishments and singular voice need to be preserved and highlighted. Her diaries are a gift, and she knew that as she was writing them. Judith Molina's diaries are a reminder to all of us that our process and thinking are as important as product, and that our politics and our art are inextricable, and that we need to write it all down for those who come later. She invites us by setting a diligent example in her diaries to leave behind, in our own words, the traces of our lives and loves and art and activism. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This morning, I'm going to be talking about Phyllis Willmott. Phyllis was a social researcher. With her husband, Peter, she was closely involved with Michael Young and the Institute of Community Studies in Bethnal Green in London, where she worked intermittently over the years, while also pursuing a freelance career as an expert in social services and social work education. And she was a prolific diarist who kept her diary from the age of 16 in 1938 until her death in 2013, a diary which numbers around 100 volumes and is now preserved here in the collections of Churchill Archives Centre. In this paper, I want to refer to one volume of her diary in particular, covering the years 1954 to 7, to explore her motivations as a long-term diarist, the meaning and purpose of her diary for her, and its connections to her other writing. At the time, she and Peter were living in an attic flat in the old house that was home to the newly established institute in Bethnal Green. Peter was working with Michael Young on research that would soon be published as Family and Kinship in East London. And Phil was living in what she characterized as chore land, maintaining a home, supporting and participating in Peter's work, caring for their 2 young children, and trying to find a way ahead in her own work outside the home, or as she put it, that enigmatic affair, my future. One of the careers Phil envisaged for herself at this time was as a writer. Writing was the word she used to describe her often frustrated attempts to sit down in front of a typewriter in snatched moments during busy days to write fiction, a novel or short stories, and non-fiction articles and book reviews, writing intended for publication. Scribbling was the word she used to describe her diary, always handwritten, sometimes in biro, but fountain pen preferred, in quarto or foolscap line notebooks, where the scribbling flowed, rarely affected by writer's block, a phrase she'd only recently discovered. Phil wrote her diary compulsively. It was effortless. I must fulfill myself by scribbling. There is no other way, she wrote. Or I must write again or die. I don't mean die physically, but the me inside, who is the only fully alive bit. Phil was a writer, and her diary was the main form her writing took. In her 1954 to 7 diary, she came to recognize and accept this. Over time, her diary would become central to and connected with all her other writing projects. What was it Phil felt so compelled to write about in her diary? Firstly, her observations of family and friends and the people and places she came into contact with in her daily life. Phil was an intuitive and curious observer who wanted to capture what she called the feeling of the day. Some days, she wrote, one is more sensitive, perceptive than on others. During this period, she was also contributing background research to family and kinship in East London. And her research, a series of thematic observations of her everyday life in Bethnal Green, soon mutated into a diary, her Bethnal Green journal, written between October 1954 and March 1955, and eventually published in 2001. Although another fragment of her research, a conversation with a neighbour about the number of family members and friends encountered on a shopping trip, did appear in Family and Kinship itself. She was perhaps drawn so quickly back into the diary form in this piece of social research because for her, observation was rooted in subjectivity, and the observer was not detached, but rather immersed in their environment and interacting with others. Although naturally introverted, she wrote in her Bethnal Green journal, anxious to try out my angle of leaning towards participator rather than observer. In the introduction to its published edition, while rejecting the idea of professional detachment, she acknowledged that her training as a social worker had sharpened my eye for not just observing details, but trying to make sense of what underlay them. She was drawn to observation, interpretation, and insight based on shared experiences, and she felt she had a perspective to express through writing her diary. The Bethnal Green Journal distilled one element of her diary keeping, observation, but another essential element of her personal diary is emotion, the expression and understanding of her emotions. Phil didn't keep her diary every day, but wrote once or twice a week, sometimes more, sometimes less, writing in immediate retrospect and recalling only those things that interested, moved, and in some cases obsessed her to the point that she couldn't stop thinking about them until she had got it down in her diary. Privacy was essential, she believed, to the open expression of her feelings, and she closely guarded the privacy of her diary. Although she herself reread it and shared extracts with her husband Peter, she would discreetly close the book if anyone else came upon her writing it, and she was sometimes reluctant to discuss her diary keeping with others. Likewise, she feared losing the book, feared what she called exposure, and rarely took it away with her, writing on loose leaf pages when she travelled and adding them into the diary later. She recognized how her diary was for her not only essential for the expression of her emotions, but also for processing them and maintaining equilibrium. She believed on rereading her diary that illegible handwriting and crossings out were a sign of emotional disturbance. And although she stopped keeping her diary during periods of anxiety, grief, or depression, she always took it up again, observing in 1955 that the escape from depression can only be gained through breaking out into writing. As with observation, for her, emotion was a way of connecting with others, of establishing contact, as she put it, and of making sense of the people and the world around her through empathy. Phil also understood herself and others through the past. Memories surface and are recorded throughout her 1954-7 diary, particularly memories of her working class childhood in the southeast London suburb of Lee, of the women in her family, her mother and Granny Noble and Granny Mann, and of her family's rural roots and urban migration. The questions prompted by memory were also questions of identity and of her shifting sense of self. As she wrote in 1960, she wanted to use her diary to explore the past as I live my present, to face each to each, and see if I can finally knit together all of life to me. A story of Phil's past first appeared outside her diary in the vignette of her grandparents' lives in the Bedfordshire village of Blenheim, included in For Richer for Poorer, Michael Young's 1952 policy paper for the Labour Party. The same story would recur in Growing Up in a London Village, the first volume of Phil's memoir. Having abandoned attempts to fictionalize her past experiences, she began writing a memoir in a burst of creativity in the summer of 1968, on holiday in rural France with the Youngs, where Peter and Michael were struggling to finish the last book they co-authored, The Symmetrical Family. 3 further volumes of memoir and a family history would follow, covering her childhood and early adult years, overlapping with her personal diary, and ending at the point in 1954 where her diary became a more continuous and detailed record. Her intention in writing a memoir was in part autobiographical, to complement her diary and fully document her life, just as later she would persuade Michael Young to record a series of oral history interviews about his early years. But her memoir was not autobiography in the narrowest sense, she wrote in the introduction to Growing Up in a London Village. Rather, the story of the social world, the time and the place that I grew up in. Phil's writing about the past incorporated personal memory, family stories, diary entries, and historical research. And growing awareness of social history informed her work, in part inspired by her friendship with historian Raphael Samuel, who she first met when he was working as Peter's research assistant at the Institute in 1959. Speaking about her London childhood to a packed meeting of history workshop in 1975 at Raphael Samuel's invitation was an important moment of affirmation on the long road to getting her memoir published. Sometimes Phyllis Wilmot wonders why she lives so much in the past, wrote Ruth Gorb in a 1995 profile in the Ham and High. Then she remembers why. It's because I don't think the past is finished. Phil's imaginative connection with the past meant she understood keeping a diary for her was partly an act of preserving the present. A diarist's sense of time passing day by day felt more real to her than the narrative structures of fiction she had experimented with and abandoned. She reread her diary, leaving traces and occasional annotations and post-it notes, and wrote of her fascination with the interplay between memory and contemporary record, what was written down and what was left out, what was remembered and what was forgotten. She also used her diary as a repository to collect evocative mementos, including letters, photographs, and other meaningful ephemera. And she worried about her diary's survival and tried to envisage its future readership, writing in 1954 of her fears that it would become part of a dusty pile of rubbish burning on some smoky bonfire one day, and asking herself later, where and when is it, if at all, that a live mind will take up the dry thread of these words, someone sitting face to book, as mine is now? By 1984, Phil was advising another diarist who contacted her not to throw her diaries away, but to ensure that the diaries reached some reliable archives. And in the early 1990s, she navigated this process for herself when she inherited the papers of her friend and colleague Geraldine Aves while writing her biography, and subsequently arranged for their donation to the Women's Library. Phil's own conviction that her personal diary might someday be preserved in an archive was strengthened by her friendship with historian David Kynaston, who was the first researcher she allowed to read her diary, then at her home in Highgate, and who encouraged her to believe in its research value for others. Having considered a number of institutions, she was drawn to Churchill Archives Centre by her connection with Michael Young, whose personal archive was already held here, and by the possibility that the two collections could be used in parallel with each other. Phil's knowledge of historical research and archives meant that she could expertly negotiate the transfer of her own personal papers. She expressed a wish that the collection be named for herself and her husband, Peter, although very few of Peter's papers survive, because she felt her diary represented both their lives and reflected their close personal and professional partnership. And having published a memoir in her own lifetime, she was familiar with the dilemma of balancing privacy and openness. and specified a closure period for her diary that would enable a regular programme of opening volumes to researchers. In conclusion, I just want to underline Phil's agency. In dealing so decisively with her own private archive, Phil challenged the gendered collecting practices of archival institutions and insisted on her visibility as a valued creator and donor of a collection. In the end, it was Phil's determination and recognition of herself as a writer that ensured the survival of her most significant work, her diary. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very delighted to be here today. So, it seems the way diarists write about male homosexuality at the beginning of the 1950s is linked to the criminal laws still prevailing in Great Britain. It also might explain why there is a kind of confidential tone in diaries as far as the subject is concerned. But did the historic shift of 1957 and 1967 in England and of 1969 in the United States of America result in any changes to gay men's diary writing? This article aims to question three aspects of a relationship between male homosexuality and diaries. Something they should hide, or something ordinary common. A voice from a particular community, or a more universal voice, how they express their intimacy. This article uses as a starting point the recent discovery made by mistake by researchers at the University of Oxford of an 1810 diary talking about homosexuality as a freer and more natural way than it is a century and a half later. So, when the diarist is not a well-known member of a cultural world who writes easily about his homosexuality, like Oscar Wilde, is it easy to find ordinary diarists writing about their intimacy and not only by mistake? We'll try to check this hypothesis about three contemporary diaries. The first written by an ordinary British gay man living as a couple with another man from the 1940s to the 1970s. The second by a supposedly heterosexual British journalist in the 1950s, 1960s. And the third by a bisexual American in the 1960s, mainly focusing on the coded and uncoded ways they talk about homosexuality. When dealing with such intimate subjects as sexuality in general and homosexuality in particular, in connection with keeping diaries, there is a first question we have to resolve. Do gay people talk that easily of their intimacy? Is it a kind of taboo subject? Is it clearly expressed or coded? Is it easy to find a diary specifically written by gay people when anybody wants to explore it for research purposes? In other words, when gay people write their diaries, is it something they may hide? Or is it merely that their sexuality is only a small part of who they are, and that finally they might live ordinary lives like anybody else apart from their intimacy? In February 2020, 3 articles were published dealing with what has been considered as major discovery in LGBTQI+ history. even if one of them mentions the fact that this discovery was made by mistake. Eamon O'Keefe, the researcher who made the discovery, explains that this aim wasn't to look at any mention of homosexuality in the 1810 diary he explored. One of the reasons being that the diary was written by a farmer, Matthew Tomlinson. What's more, according to specialists in the subject, except from aristocratic or intellectual circles, people did not express their opinion that freely on a subject that was still severely punished and criminalized by death penalty. Nevertheless, the author of a diary wasn't gay himself, and it seems in some passages of a diary that he was sharing his point of view with other villagers. Even if a diary is an intimate object and doesn't aim to be read by others, there's no questioning here about hiding the subject or any personal opinion on it. According to Mr. O'Keefe, it's on the contrary as if talking about homosexuality and the cruelty with which it was punished was natural and ordinary. Mr. Tomlinson himself uses the adjective natural to express the fact that some men are born a way in which it's natural to have intimacy with other men. And as a believer, he even considers there may be in it in some men, and it should be forgiven and not condemned. What is interesting to notice in Mr. Tomlinson's analysis of homosexuality, whether it's given at birth by God or a deliberate choice, is that it's a subject no one should fear to discuss and that anybody could even consider to be ordinary. Would Mr. Tomlinson have talked about homosexuality that freely if he was gay himself and subject to the death penalty if convicted of practicing sodomy? A comparison with a second example might answer this question. This is a diary written by Mr. Mahoney, a British gay man living as a couple with Mr. Walton from the 1940s to the 1970s. Sorry. In these diaries, even if the fact the author is gay isn't hidden, it's often by mistake that a researcher discovers it. Certainly because if homosexuality is a part of their identity, it's not what characterizes them as whole human beings. What is meant here by mistake is that when we're specifically looking for diaries written by gay people, it's only if we persevere that we'll find them, or if we have a chance, as I did, to have the work done beforehand by the archivist services. And since the Bishopsgate Institute possesses a huge collection of historical LGBTQI+ documents, there was no surprise in finding in the Great Diary Project diaries written by gay men and women. My sincere gratitude to the Bishopsgate Institute and the Great Diary Project for allowing me to explore all these diaries. Right from the beginning, Mr. Mahoney's diaries describe the ordinary lives of two men living together. They could have been brothers or father and son. There wouldn't have been the slightest difference. Each page begins with Mr. Mahoney waking up and ends up with the same going to bed. The other contents talk about trips, everyday tasks, family, and work. Sometimes it talks about a bath, having a bath, and we could have expected, for example, a bath together, any element that could prove the two men were sharing their intimacy, but there is nothing about that. Although they were gay at a time when it was criminalized, and they lived simple and ordinary lives. The LGBTQI+ history is often marked by changes in legislation and in public opinion, and some of these dates are examined throughout the corpus of three diaries. The question is to know whether the diarist is affected as an individual the same way as the community, and if he talks about that. And what attitude is adopted by people who are not personally concerned by the change, but who take an interest in the matter. Another question is about the relationship between involvement in a group or as an activist and the fact that diarists may also be interested in what concerns them as an individual within a community without becoming a fully fledged activist. As far as the three diaries are concerned, there are 4 dates we will focus on: 1957 and the Wolfenden Report in Britain, 1967 and the Sexual Offences Act in Britain, 1969 and the Stonewall riots in the USA, and 1972 with the first gay British magazine in Britain, and the first London Gay Pride. Right from the beginning, Mr. Mahoney's diaries, excuse me. Since these events changed a lot of things in the way the gay community was perceived in the public opinion, we could expect a reference of these events in any of the 3 diaries, but that is not the case. As far as Mr. Mahoney and Mr. Walden are concerned, their age might explain their lack of involvement, because when the 1967 Sexual Offences Act was published, it might have been more of a concern of younger people, and they were, Mr. Mahoney was born in 1908 and Mr. Walden in 1910. Mr. Kirkman, as a journalist, must often use quotes in his diaries, and we cannot be sure that it tells us everything. In 1956-57, he regularly talks about his visits to Brighton and subject he was investigating, and he sometimes skips names, but most of the time his diary is made of brief notes. So when talking about the Wolfenden Report, for example, he only mentions the prostitution part and nothing about homosexuality. So he either didn't feel concerned about the subject of homosexuality, or he preferred not to express his opinion on the subject, or maybe he not have felt at ease with the subject of homosexuality or sexuality due to strong religious feelings. This last hypothesis might not be the right one, since even if it was brief, Mr. Kirkman evoked prostitution and in another instance expressed his negative feelings about shows featuring nude women. In the case of Mr. Cooper, he never mentioned Stonewall in his 1969 diaries, but what is surprising is that he mentions Judy Garland's death on the 22nd of June, 1969. In Mr. Mahoney's and Mr. Mahoney's diaries, in fact, there is no mention about what happened in 1955, 1960, and 1967, excuse me, and 1970, 1972, nothing. Maybe these men, in fact, because they were living their homosexuality individually, they were not involved in the community, either because they didn't know of any community, lack of information or interest, or maybe they didn't want to get involved in a community that didn't correspond to who they were as gays in their everyday life, sorry. Oops, sorry, I'm going very fast. Oops. When anybody talks about their sexuality in their diary, if they decide to talk about it, what is the most important element they want to write about? Their feelings, romanticism and love, or on the contrary, their sexuality and details about their potential sexual partners and their fantasies? In Mr. Mahoney's diaries, nothing is expressed about any sexual interaction or fantasy and about any feelings except for the 1972 diary and the ones following that year. Because in 1971, his partner died. And what at the beginning wasn't necessary to express their relationship, it became necessary. And so it clearly expresses how much he misses his partner and how bad the day was to bear without him by his side. Even if other times he writes how much he feels his partner's presence near him. There are two anecdotes, one funny and not very funny in this diaries. When he is talking about a man, he dialed a wrong number. This man gave his personal number, and he said in the diary, "Oh, with his partner, I found this man nice," but previously he was also able to express his guilt when feeling something for another man. Mr. Cooper has a different approach towards his intimacy. On the one hand, there are lots of empty pages in his diary when we know nothing about what he is experiencing or feeling. And on the other hand, when he is mentioning his temporary potential partners or something he witnessed concerning sexuality and that upsets him, and he has no kind of censorship towards what he's writing, giving details about them. And also pictures. As you'll see, there are full frontal, as I showed previously, there are full frontal pictures of nude men in his diaries. It's very explicit. But we can question, in fact, why it felt necessary for him to express his homosexuality in a way that could have shocked people, since it was still a taboo. So could he be an activist who ignored he was, behaving as if he was, because he was still married, although he seemed attracted to men, and his wife, what is surprising, knew about his attraction. As a conclusion, we might say that when we keep a diary, there is no difference in the way we write our diary, whether we're straight or gay. In fact, most of the time, diarists are talking about their ordinary life, even if sometimes they like to focus people's attention on what is a part of their identity. In that case, they may choose to provoke, or they may consider that is important for them due to the fact they don't feel well about that. In other words, a gay is not hiding more or less his sexuality in a diary, as a heterosexual would. The real difficulty is to identify the places where we may find diaries specifically written by gays, because we may find them by chance or after very long and intense research.